Edward VIII reigned for less than a year, yet his shadow still stretches across the British monarchy. His abdication in 1936 is often told as a love story, one man choosing a woman over a crown. But behind the romance lay a far darker bargain, a deal struck, terms imposed, and a resentment that the royal family never truly forgave. Edward became king in January 1936, inheriting a throne weighted with duty, restraint, and constitutional limits. He had been raised to rule, adored by the public for his modern charm and informal manner. But from the beginning, Edward resisted the role. He disliked paperwork, ignored ministers, and bristled at the idea that a king should reign but not rule. In private, he was already bound to a relationship the establishment considered unacceptable, an American divorcée named Wallis Simpson. Wallace was not merely twice divorced. She was outspoken, worldly, and immune to royal mystique. For the Church of England, the government, and the palace, her presence beside the king threatened the moral and political foundations of the monarchy. When Edward made clear he intended to marry her, the crisis erupted. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin warned that such a marriage would be unconstitutional. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, signalled opposition. The press, initially silent, prepared to explode. What followed was not a single decision, but a negotiation. Edward proposed a compromise. He would marry Wallace, but she would not become queen. This morganatic marriage was rejected outright. The government would not bend, and the crown could not be reshaped to fit one man's desire. The choice was stark: abdicate or abandon Wallace. Edward chose abdication. On December 11th, 1936, he signed away the throne and addressed the nation, declaring he could not carry the burden of kingship without the help and support of the woman I love. His younger brother became George VI, a reluctant monarch thrust into power on the eve of war. But abdication was only the beginning of the deal. Edward was given the title Duke of Windsor. He retained style and status, but not trust. Wallace would never receive the title Her Royal Highness, a decision that cut deep and was never reversed. Financial arrangements were controlled, residences limited, access to family tightly managed. The message was clear: you may leave, but you will not belong. The resentment hardened during World War II. Rumours, some documented, some whispered, circulated about Edward's political sympathies and his naivety toward Nazi Germany. In 1937, the Windsors toured Germany and met Adolf Hitler, a public relations disaster that haunted Edward for the rest of his life. Whether he was a traitor or simply reckless remains debated, but the damage was irreversible. The royal family, already furious at the abdication, now saw him as a liability. Exile became permanent. The Windsors lived mostly in France, glamorous yet isolated, welcomed in high society, but frozen out by the crown. Invitations were rare. Trust was non-existent. When Edward was appointed governor of the Bahamas during the war, it was widely seen as a way to keep him far from Europe and far from influence. The deal, in essence, was this: Edward would have his marriage, his title, and a comfortable life, but he would surrender not just the crown, but forgiveness. The monarchy would survive by drawing a hard line, turning personal betrayal into institutional memory. After the war, the breach never healed. Edward and Wallace attended few family events. They were absent at moments that mattered. When Edward died in 1972, Queen Elizabeth II allowed Wallace to use the HRH style socially, but never officially. Even in death, the compromise held. Edward VIII believed history would vindicate him as a romantic martyr. Instead, he became a cautionary tale. The king who mistook privilege for freedom and love for immunity. The monarchy forgave the act, perhaps, but never the terms under which it was forced to endure it. That is the deal they never forgave, not the abdication alone, but the humiliation of being challenged, cornered, and compelled to choose survival over blood. And in royal families, survival always comes first. Now, let the weight of that history settle like dust in a quiet room. We must travel back before the scandal, before the heartbreak, to the very beginning of the thread. Close your eyes. Imagine the soft wavering glow of gaslight struggling against the thick grey fog of Victorian England. Can you smell the faint scent of coal smoke mixed with the wet earth of Richmond Park? There is a stillness here, a hush that belongs to a world without cars, without radios, where the loudest sound is the ticking of a grandfather clock in a hallway that stretches on forever. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. We find ourselves at White Lodge, a Georgian house nestled in the greenery of Surrey on a summer evening in 1894. It is June 23rd and the air is heavy with humidity and anticipation. Inside, a baby boy has just been born. He is small, fair, and instantly burdened with a name that reads like a history book: Edward, Albert, Christian, George, Andrew, Patrick, David. To the world, he will one day be Edward VIII. To his family, he is simply David. He arrives not just into a family, but into a hierarchy as rigid as stone. His great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, is still on the throne, an ancient diminutive figure in perpetual mourning black, commanding an empire on which the sun never sets. David is third in line for this colossal inheritance, born into the golden twilight of the Victorian age. But if you look closely at this nursery scene, the gold begins to flake away, revealing the cold iron beneath. There is a persistent myth that royal children of this era lived lives of spoiled luxury, endlessly pampered by doting servants. The reality for little David is starkly different. His world is one of terrifying isolation. His parents, the Duke and Duchess of York, later King George V and Queen Mary, are distant figures, visible mostly at appointed times like planets orbiting far from their sun. The Duke, a naval man with a beard as stiff as his collar, runs his household with the strict discipline of a battleship. He is a man who values punctuality above affection and order above understanding. Historians often debate the true nature of George VI's parenting. Some argue he was simply a product of his time, a typical Victorian father who believed in hardening boys for duty. Others point to his chilling remark, "I was afraid of my father, and I'm going to see to it that my children are afraid of me," as evidence of a more active cruelty. Regardless of the intent, the effect on David is profound. He learns early on that love is something you earn through silence and obedience, not something freely given. But the deepest shadows in the nursery come not from the parents, but from the staff. In a twist of fate that seems drawn from a Gothic novel, David's first few years are dominated by a sadistic nanny. This is not a rumour, but a documented historical truth that the royal family only discovered years later. This head nurse, whose name has largely faded into the mists of the domestic service records, developed a twisted possessiveness over the young prince. Before bringing David into the drawing room to see his parents, she would pinch him hard, twisting his sensitive skin until he screamed in pain. She would then present the sobbing, hysterical child to the Duke and Duchess, who, annoyed by the noise, would promptly wave them away. "Take him away," the Duke would bark, reinforcing the nanny's absolute control. For the first 3 years of his life, David's primary emotional experience is a cycle of pain and rejection orchestrated by the one person paid to protect him. He learns that to be seen is to be hurt, and that his parents' presence is a fleeting conditional reward. Though the nanny is eventually dismissed, caught not for her cruelty, but for her insolence to a superior, the damage is etched into the boy's psyche. He grows up with a golden shadow hanging over him. He is told he is special, destined, and revered, yet he feels small, frightened, and perpetually unsafe. As the gaslight flickers in the nursery of White Lodge, we see a boy pressing his face against the cold window pane, watching the deer move through the mist of the park. He is a prince of the blood, surrounded by servants, yet he is perhaps the loneliest child in England. He wears sailor suits and stiff collars, forced to smile for photographers who capture the image of a perfect heir, while inside a restless, anxious spirit begins to take shape. He is already learning the art of the mask, the dazzling smile that hides the trembling hand. And as the 19th century bleeds into the 20th, dragging the old world toward a new and violent era, David stands in the centre of the nursery floor. Surrounded by toys he is too afraid to play with, waiting for a permission that never comes. The golden cage is locked and the key has been swallowed by duty. The years dissolve like mist over the Thames, and the frightened boy in the nursery grows into a slender, watchful youth. The heavy, stifling curtains of the Victorian era are finally pulled back with the death of the old Queen in 1901, and the world steps into the brief sunlit garden party of the Edwardian age. But for David, the change of scenery brings no freedom. It only widens the stage upon which he must perform. At 13, he is sent away to the Royal Naval College at Osborne, a place designed to forge iron men for the Empire's dreadnoughts. One might assume that the heir to the throne would be treated with deferential velvet kid gloves, shielded from the rough and tumble of cadet life. The historical reality, however, is far more bruising. David is small for his age, slight of build, and cursed with a sensitive, almost feminine beauty that makes him an instant target in a brutal environment of adolescent masculinity. There is a story, often whispered but confirmed by biographers, that his fellow cadets nicknamed him Sardine. It is not a term of endearment. They would sometimes pile on top of him, pressing the future King of England into the floorboards until the breath was crushed from his lungs, a cruel reminder that bloodlines offer no protection against the tyranny of the playground. He endures this bullying in silence, learning another hard lesson that will define his adulthood. Vulnerability must be hidden at all costs. He learns to smile when he wants to weep, to stand straight when he wants to curl into a ball. This rigorous training in suppression serves him well when his grandfather, the jovial King Edward VII, dies in 1910, and David's severe father ascends the throne as George V. Suddenly, the stakes are raised. David is no longer just a prince. He is the Duke of Cornwall, the Duke of Rothesay, the heir apparent. And in 1911, the machinery of state decides it is time to present this charming prince to the world in a spectacle of medieval pageantry reinvented for the modern eye. The setting is Caernarfon Castle in Wales, a fortress of grey stone rising from the water, ancient and imposing. The event is the investiture of the Prince of Wales, a ceremony that has fallen into disuse for centuries, but is now resurrected by the cunning politician David Lloyd George to soothe Welsh nationalism and bolster the monarchy. For the 17-year-old David, it is a nightmare of embarrassment. He is ordered to wear a costume that borders on the theatrical. White satin breeches, a mantle of purple velvet ermine, and a sword belt. In his memoirs, he would later recall looking at himself in the mirror and feeling a deep, burning shame, convinced he looked less like a future king and more like a fantastical character from a pantomime who had taken a wrong turn on the way to the stage. He argues with his father, begging to wear a simple uniform, but the king's word is law. You will wear what you are told, is the essence of the command. And so, under the blazing July sun, amidst the roar of choirs and the cheering of thousands, the slight figure kneels on a cushion of green velvet. The heavy gold coronet is placed upon his fair hair. He looks fragile, almost ethereal, like a figure from a stained glass window brought to life. But as he rises and turns to face the crowd, something alchemical happens. The shame vanishes, replaced by a dazzling, crooked smile that lights up his face. The crowd does not see a boy in satin breeches. They see a fairy tale prince. They roar their approval, a sound like crashing waves that washes over him, intoxicating and strange. In that moment, the Prince Charming is born. Charming. He realizes that he possesses a power his father lacks, the power of star quality. The cameras, those great wooden boxes with their exploding flash powder, love him. They capture the sadness in his eyes and the warmth of his smile, creating a contrast that makes him irresistible to the public. He becomes the first royal pop star, a global celebrity before the term truly exists. He is sent to Oxford, to Magdalen College, where he is supposed to acquire the intellectual heft of a monarch. Scholarly debate still circles around David's intelligence during these years. Was he truly incapable of deep thought, as some tutors lamented, or simply uninterested in the abstract? He struggles with books, finding them dry and lifeless. He writes essays that are short and simplistic, but while he fails to master constitutional history, he masters the art of being liked. He learns to play the banjo, he learns to smoke, and he learns to drink, habits that loosen the knot of anxiety permanently tightening in his chest. He discovers that a few casual words to a gardener or a shopkeeper are worth more in public goodwill than 1,000 state papers. He begins to cultivate a style that is distinctly unroyal, preferring soft collars and tweed jackets to the stiff uniforms his father worships. He is testing the boundaries, fraying the edges of the golden cage. Yet beneath the banjo playing and the bright social calendar, the void remains. He develops a near-obsessive concern with his weight and appearance, terrified of becoming heavy like the older men in his family. He eats almost nothing, often just an apple for lunch, and exercises frantically, trying to sculpt a body that feels like his own, in a life that belongs to the state. He is surrounded by people, yet he has no one. He writes long, emotional letters to his mother, Queen Mary, pouring out his feelings, but her replies are often cool, focused on his schedule and his sartorial choices rather than his soul. He is a man starving for intimacy in a banquet hall of acquaintances. The public sees a golden youth, blessed by fortune, dancing through the ballrooms of London with a grace that seems effortless. They do not see the nervous energy that keeps him moving, the fear of silence, the desperate need for validation that the cheering crowds can momentarily feed but never truly satisfy. He is a prince who has everything, yet feels he possesses nothing of substance. As 1914 approaches, the world hums with a tension that matches his own. The long summer of the old order is drawing to a close. The maps are about to be redrawn, and the satin breeches will soon be traded for khaki wool. David stands on the precipice of manhood, adored by millions who do not know him, and misunderstood by the few who do. He is ready to escape the suffocating velvet of the palace, ready to prove that there is blood, not just blue dye, in his veins. The stage is set for a tragedy of global proportions, and the prince, desperate for a role that feels real, is about to walk straight into the fire, seeking a purpose he has been denied since birth. The golden summer of 1914 broke apart, not with a whimper, but with the deafening crack of a pistol in Sarajevo, followed by the thunder of artillery rolling across the plains of Europe. For millions of young men, the outbreak of the Great War was a summons to a terrifying destiny. For Edward, Prince of Wales, it felt like a liberation. Finally, here was a chance to shed the satin breeches and the suffocating etiquette of the court. Here was a crucible where a man was measured not by his titles but by his courage. He was 20 years old, fit, eager, and desperate to serve. He rushed to the Grenadier Guards, commissioning his uniforms, ready to march alongside the friends he had made at Oxford. He imagined the camaraderie of the mess tent, the shared danger, the noble sacrifice, but he had forgotten the iron cage of his birthright. The first crushing blow to his ambitions comes in a sterile government office, facing the formidable Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War. Kitchener is a man of granite. Peering out from beneath heavy brows, the embodiment of the Empire's military might, Edward pleads his case with a desperate intensity. He argues that he is fit, that he is trained, and then he plays his ace card. "I have 4 brothers," he tells Kitchener, his voice trembling with frustration. "If I am killed, it does not matter. The succession is secure." It is a chillingly pragmatic assessment of his own life, revealing just how little he values his own safety compared to the desire to be ordinary. Kitchener, however, does not blink. He looks the young prince in the eye and delivers a verdict that stings more than a slap. "If you were certain to be killed, sir, I do not know if I should be right to restrain you," the field marshal rumbles, "but I cannot take the chance of your being taken prisoner." The logic is unassailable. A dead prince is a tragedy. A captured prince is a geopolitical catastrophe, a bargaining chip of unimaginable value. Edward is crushed. He is commissioned, yes, but he is marked. While his friends march toward the mud and fire of the Western Front, he is assigned to the staff of the Commander-in-Chief, Sir John French. He is to be a red tab, one of the despised staff officers who sit safely behind the lines, moving pins on a map while other men die. He arrives in France not as a warrior, but as a spectator. The humiliation is acute. He refers to himself bitterly as a chocolate soldier, pretty to look at, but liable to melt if things get too hot. He is given a chauffeured car, a comfortable billet, and a retinue to ensure his safety. But the prince is stubborn, and the war is chaotic. He begins a campaign of quiet rebellion against his handlers. He hops on a green army bicycle, pedalling furiously away from headquarters, slipping through the cordon of safety to get closer to the sharp end of the war. He navigates the cratered roads of Flanders, the air growing thick with the acrid stench of cordite, rotting vegetation, and unwashed bodies. He sees the landscape of hell, the shattered skeletons of trees, the waterlogged trenches, the exhausted faces of men caked in grey mud. He does not recoil. He leans in. He talks to the privates and the non-commissioned officers, offering them cigarettes, listening to their stories in his halting, sympathetic way. For the soldiers, seeing the Prince of Wales standing in the mud, looking just as tired and dishevelled as they feel, is a shock of electricity. They cheer him, not with the polite applause of a garden party, but with the rough guttural roar of men who feel forgotten by God and country. There is a historical debate that lingers over Edward's war service. Was he merely a war tourist, dabbling in danger for the thrill of it? Or did he genuinely share the risks? The truth likely lies in a terrifying moment in 1915 near the town of Lewes. Edward visits a forward position, insisting on seeing the ground for himself. He leaves his car and walks up to a vantage point. Moments later, a German shell screams out of the sky and slams into the earth exactly where his car is waiting. The explosion is earth-shattering. When the smoke clears, the vehicle is a twisted wreck and his driver is dead. Edward returns to find the crater. staring into the smoking hole where he should have been sitting. He is shaken, deeply and permanently. He keeps a jagged piece of shrapnel from that shell as a memento, a grim reminder of the lottery of survival. He writes in his diary, not of his own near miss, but of the driver, expressing a profound guilt-ridden sorrow. This proximity to death changes him. It drives a wedge between him and the older generation. The generals in their chateau and his father in Buckingham Palace that will never be removed. He begins to view the military and political establishment with a cynical eye. He sees the slaughter of the Somme and Passchendaele as a betrayal of the youth of Britain by incompetent old men. He feels a burning solidarity with the Tommies, the common soldiers. He believes he understands them, and that they understand him, in a way the establishment never can. This belief plants a seed of populism in his heart, the idea that a king's power comes from his connection to the people, not from the constitution or the church. It is a dangerous idea for a constitutional monarch, but in the trenches, it feels like the only truth that matters. Yet, there is a strange dissonance in his war. While he visits the front, he also enjoys the glittering nightlife of Paris when on leave. He is handsome, royal, and in uniform, an irresistible combination. He discovers that the intensity of war heightens other appetites. He begins to have affairs, seeking comfort and distraction in the arms of women who, like the soldiers, live for the moment. The golden boy is becoming a man of the world, shedding the moral strictures of his Victorian childhood. He learns that rules are for other people, and that in the chaos of war, consequences often feel distant and abstract. As the war drags on, grinding millions of lives into the mud, Edward feels a growing sense of futility. He wants a medal, the military cross, like the other officers of his rank. When he is finally awarded one in 1916, he is ashamed. He feels he hasn't earned it, that it is just another piece of royal theatre. "I feel such a swine," he writes to his mistress at the time, "taking a decoration I haven't won." He pins it on because he must, but it burns a hole in his conscience. He watches the best of his generation, the poets, the athletes, the scholars, vanish into the abyss. He is the survivor, the one left behind to carry the torch. But the flame is flickering. He returns from the Great War not with a sense of triumph, but with a profound restlessness and a deep-seated cynicism about the duties that await him. The mud of Flanders has stained his soul, washing away the last of the fairy tale prince and leaving behind a man who is angry, lonely, and quietly desperate for a life that feels his own. The guns eventually fall silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, but the war inside David has only just begun. He steps out of the trenches and back into the golden cage, but now he knows the bars are made of bones. The guns of the Great War had fallen silent, but the silence was brief. It was quickly replaced by a new frenetic rhythm. The syncopated beat of jazz, the roar of the roaring 20s, and for the Prince of Wales, the ceaseless clatter of train wheels and the thrum of ship engines. The British Empire, battered and bruised by the conflict, was fraying at the edges. Nationalism was stirring in India. Labour unrest was simmering at home. The Dominions were asking what, exactly, their sacrifice had purchased. The politicians in Westminster, led by the wily David Lloyd George, saw a solution. They needed a glue to bind the cracking imperial mosaic together, something shiny, modern, and universally appealing. They looked at the handsome, melancholic young man who had charmed the soldiers in the trenches, and they saw their answer. They would turn David into a product. He was to become the Empire's salesman, a royal travelling salesman packed off to every corner of the globe to sell the brand of Britannia. Between 1919 and 1925, Edward embarked on a series of tours that were staggering in their scope and exhaustion. He travelled over 150,000 miles, a distance equal to circling the globe 6 times. He boarded the battle cruiser HMS Renown, converted into a floating royal yacht, and sailed into the unknown. Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand, India, Japan, Africa, and South America. The itinerary was a blur of geography. To the newsreels and the newspapers, it was a triumph of unbroken sunshine and cheering crowds. They called him the Prince of Sunshine, a title that must have felt like a cruel joke to a man who carried a perpetual rain cloud in his heart. In every city, the script was the same. The royal train would pull into a station draped in bunting. The local mayor, sweating in his chains of office, would deliver a speech of mind-numbing dullness, and the prince would step onto the platform, flash that famous crooked smile, and wave. The reaction was pandemonium. Women fainted. Men climbed lampposts for a glimpse. Barriers collapsed under the weight of humanity. In North America, the crowds were so aggressive in their affection that they physically mobbed him. He was pulled, grabbed, and patted as if he were a lucky talisman. The physical toll was immediate and visceral. His right hand, shaken by thousands of people a day, became so swollen and bruised that it turned black and blue. At night, in the privacy of his cabin, he would have to soak it in Epsom salts, the throbbing pain keeping him awake. He eventually developed a technique of gripping the other person's hand first, high up on the thumb, to prevent them from crushing his fingers, a small secret defensive maneuver in a war of affection. There is a moment of dark humour in the sheer repetition of it all. In one Canadian town, after enduring his 100th civic reception of the week, he turned to a staff member and whispered, "I have a new definition of hell, to be the Prince of Wales in a small town." He was not trying to be cruel. He was simply drowning in a sea of platitudes. He was becoming a master of the royal glazed look, appearing to listen intently while his mind drifted thousands of miles away. But beneath the surface of this glittering tour, a dangerous hollowness was expanding. Historians and biographers often point to these years as the moment Edward stopped growing intellectually. He ceased reading books almost entirely. He stopped trying to understand the complex constitutional machinery he was destined to head. Instead, he learned to survive on adrenaline and nervous energy. He discovered that he didn't need to be wise or knowledgeable. He just needed to be charming. He could win over a room of hostile Australian trade unionists simply by making a self-deprecating joke or asking about their families. It was a superpower, but it was also a trap. He was learning that his personality was more powerful than his position, a lesson that would prove fatal later on. The tour of India in 1921 brought the cracks into sharp relief. The subcontinent was seething with the desire for independence, led by Mahatma Gandhi, who had called for a boycott of the royal visit. In some cities, the prince drove through streets that were eerily empty, the shutters closed in a silent, ghostly protest. It unnerved him. He was used to adoration, not indifference. Yet, in other places, the boycott failed, and the crowds were as suffocating as ever. He played polo, he shot tigers, an act of imperial theatre that sits uncomfortably with modern sensibilities, and he danced until dawn. But the letters he wrote home to his then mistress, Freda Dudley Ward, reveal a man on the edge of a nervous breakdown. He wrote of feeling fed up, bored stiff, and lonely as hell. He poured out his soul in a stream of childish, needy prose, complaining about the heat, the officials, and the endless duty. He described himself as a prisoner, paraded around for the amusement of others. To cope, he drank. The cocktail hour became the most important appointment of the day. He smoked incessantly, a cigarette always burning between his fingers. He developed a frantic need for exercise to sweat out the toxins and the stress running around the decks of the Renown, or playing squash with a violence that frightened his opponents. He was a man running away from himself, moving so fast that his own shadow couldn't catch up. The tragedy of the Empire's salesman was that he was selling a product he didn't believe in. He saw the British Empire not as a glorious civilizing force, but as a tired, creaking machine run by out-of-touch old men. He offended colonial governors by showing up late, wearing the wrong uniform, or openly mocking the rigid etiquette they held dear. He preferred the company of American socialites and jazz musicians to that of knights and peers. He was becoming Americanized, a pejorative term in the halls of Buckingham Palace, synonymous with being superficial, fast, and dangerously modern. Yet, the public saw none of this doubt. They saw a hero. When he returned to London, he was greeted as a conquering Caesar. He had done his duty. He had shaken the hands, smiled the smiles, and kept the sun from setting on the empire for a little while longer. But the man who stepped off the ship was burnt out. He had given pieces of himself to millions of strangers until he felt there was nothing left for himself. He had been loved by the world, but he felt known by no one. The noise of the crowd still rang in his ears, a deafening roar that drowned out his own thoughts. He needed silence. He needed a place where the cameras couldn't follow, where the mask could be dropped, and where the Prince of Sunshine could finally sit in the dark. He needed a fortress, not to keep enemies out, but to keep the world at bay. And he would find it in a crumbling, ivy-covered folly on the edge of Windsor Great Park. In the late 1920s, the Prince of Wales found his sanctuary. It was not a palace of marble and gold, but a strange, turreted fantasy hidden within the ancient trees of Windsor Great Park. Fort Belvadier was a folly, built in the 18th century as a decorative afterthought for a royal duke who wanted to play at being a soldier. Over the years, it had been neglected, its stone walls dampened by the English rain, its gardens overgrown with ivy and brambles. Most royals would have looked at the damp, gloomy structure and ordered it demolished. Edward looked at it and saw home. He fell in love with the fort, as he called it, with an intensity he usually reserved for people. It became his personal fiefdom, the one place on earth where his father's shadow could not reach. He poured his own money and sweat into its renovation, not as a distant patron, but as a hands-on labourer. He would spend weekends in muddy trousers and a ragged sweater, hacking away at the undergrowth with a machete, digging drainage ditches and planting rhododendrons. Visitors, expecting to be greeted by a royal host in a drawing room, would often find the heir to the throne waist-deep in a swamp, sweating and happy, shouting instructions to his staff. Inside, he created a world that was shocking in its modernity. He banished the heavy Victorian furniture, the dark mahogany, and the clutter of ornaments that defined his parents' palaces. In their place, he installed clean lines, white walls, and modern conveniences. He was obsessed with American gadgets. Ice machines, cocktail shakers, radios, and telephones were in every room. He even installed a Turkish bath, a private indulgence where he could steam away the stress of London. The fort became a temple to the new, the comfortable, and the private. But Fort Belvedere was more than just a house. It was a stage set for a new kind of royal life. Here, Edward gathered a court that horrified the establishment. Gone were the dukes and the bishops. In their place came a glittering, eclectic mix of high society's rebels, American heiresses, witty playwrights, jazz musicians, and businessmen with questionable reputations. It was a fast set, fueled by cocktails, gossip, and the latest records from Broadway. The atmosphere was one of permanent, slightly desperate gaiety. They played games, they danced, they drank, and they pretended that the outside world, with its duties and its depressions, did not exist. At the centre of this carousel stood Edward, playing the role of the perfect host. He would mix the drinks himself, shaking martinis with a professional flourish. He would play the bagpipes, marching around the dining table while his guests covered their ears and laughed. He was charming, attentive, and seemingly carefree. But those who looked closely saw the cracks. His restlessness was palpable. He could never sit still. He would jump up from dinner to change the record, move to the window to check the weather, or light another cigarette before the last one was finished. He was a man trying to outrun his own boredom, terrified of the moment the music stopped. It was in this secluded, feverish atmosphere that Edward's emotional life began to curdle. He had always been drawn to strong, married women, safe targets for his affection because they were unattainable. He had spent years in a devoted, almost submissive relationship with Frida Dudley Ward, a gentle, intelligent woman who listened to his anxieties and soothed his nerves. But by the early 1930s, Frida's quiet comfort was no longer enough. He was craving something sharper, something more dangerous. He drifted into an affair with Thelma Furness, another American, glamorous and worldly. It was Thelma who presided over the weekends at the fort, acting as the hostess, the confidant, and the gatekeeper. Yet, even with Thelma, there was a sense of impermanence. Edward was searching for a missing piece, a force that could dominate him completely and relieve him of the burden of making decisions. He wanted to be mothered and managed. He was a prince who commanded an empire, but in his heart, he wanted to be commanded. The fort, with its high walls and hidden gates, was a place where he could indulge this secret desire for submission. Outside the walls of the fort, the world was darkening. The Great Depression was biting deep into the bones of Britain. Unemployment lines stretched for miles. Hunger marches were taking to the roads. Fascism was rising in Europe. But inside the fort, the talk was of parties, fashion, and the next weekend's guest list. Edward was not indifferent to the suffering of his people. He made genuine efforts to visit depressed areas, but his private life was hermetically sealed from the public reality. He was creating a bubble, a fragile ecosystem of pleasure and denial. It is easy to judge him for this retreat, but there is a tragedy in it too. The fort was the only place where he felt he could be David rather than His Royal Highness. It was a desperate attempt to carve out a human-sized life in a destiny that was too big for him. He was like a child building a fort out of sofa cushions, hiding from the adults, pretending that if he stayed inside long enough, the rules wouldn't apply to him. But history has a way of breaching even the thickest walls. The fort, designed to keep the world out, would eventually become the setting for the very crisis that would bring his world crashing down. It was here, in the flickering light of the fireplace, amidst the sound of clinking glasses and jazz, that the final act would be prepared. The stage was set, the lighting was perfect, and the leading man was waiting in the wings. All that was missing was the leading lady, and she was coming. She was crossing the Atlantic, bringing with her a sharp wit, a stark elegance, and a destiny that would shatter the peace of the fort forever. The sanctuary was about to become a trap, and the prince who played at being ordinary was about to meet a woman who would demand that he make an extraordinary choice. The date is January 10th, 1931, a Saturday buried deep in the frozen heart of an English winter. The setting is Borough Court, a hunting lodge in Leicestershire, where the air smells of damp wool, wood smoke, and the wet fur of horses. It is here, amidst the landed gentry and the ritual slaughter of the fox hunt, that the timeline of the British monarchy fractures. The event is a dinner party, unremarkable in almost every way, except for one guest who has been added at the last minute to fill a chair. Her name is Wallis Simpson. She's 34 years old, an American living in London with her second husband, Ernest. She's not a beauty in the classical sense. In fact, photographers often struggle to capture her, finding her jaw too square and her features too sharp for the soft focus lens of the era. But she possesses something far more arresting than beauty. She has style, a weaponized elegance that makes the frills and flounces of the English aristocracy look dowdy and tired. She enters the room not with a curtsy, but with a gaze that assesses everything, the furniture, the guests and the prints, with a cool, detached amusement. The meeting between Edward and Wallace has been mythologized into a thunderclap of instant destiny, a moment where eyes locked and souls merged. The historical reality is far more mundane and perhaps more telling. Edward, playing the dutiful host, approaches her with the standard conversational gambit he uses on all Americans. "You must miss the central heating of your own country," he remarks, a polite, forgettable observation about the drafty English house. A typical courtier would have agreed, simpered, and complimented the prince on his insight. Wallace does not. She looks at the future King of England and replies with a dry, almost mocking tone, "I am sorry, sir, but you have disappointed me." The prince is startled. "In what way?" he asks. "Every American woman who comes to your country is always asked that same question," she says. "I had hoped for something more original from the Prince of Wales." It's a moment of electric shock. For 40 years, Edward has been surrounded by deference, by people who laugh too hard at his jokes and agree with his every banality. Suddenly, here is a woman who not only refuses to flatter him, but challenges him. She treats him not as a semi-divine being, but as a man who needs to try harder. In that instant, the dynamic is set. She is the teacher, he is the pupil, she is the critic, he is the performer, desperate for a good review. It was not love at first sight. Edward actually found her hard initially, and she found him merely charming. But it was the planting of a hook that would eventually drag him from the throne. Over the next 3 years, the relationship grew in the shadows, nurtured in the cocktail-soaked evenings of London's high society. Wallace was different from the soft, compliant women Edward was used to. She was a woman of the jazz age, ambitious, resilient, and carrying the scars of a chaotic life. Born in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, she had grown up in genteel poverty, dependent on the charity of wealthy relatives. She had learned early that survival required armor. Her first marriage to an alcoholic naval pilot had been a disaster of abuse and wandering, teaching her to rely on no one but herself. She had clawed her way into British society through sheer force of will, mastering the arts of the dinner table, the perfect martini, and the cutting remark. She brought a brittle, shiny modernity into Edward's velvet-draped world. Historians and psychologists still debate the true nature of their bond. Was it purely sexual? Rumours swirled, then and now, about ancient Chinese techniques Wallace supposedly learned in the brothels of the Far East, a salacious and likely racist myth invented by her enemies to explain her hold over the king. A more grounded psychological interpretation suggests something deeper and more poignant. Edward, the boy who was pinched by his nanny and ignored by his father, was looking for a mother figure who could also be a lover. He craved dominance. He wanted a woman who would organise his life, tell him what to wear, criticise his table manners, and make the decisions he found so exhausting. Wallace, with her bossy, organised, controlling nature, fit this void perfectly. She didn't treat him like a king. She treated him like a naughty boy who needed managing, and he adored it. By 1934, the affair had moved from the fringes to the centre of Edward's life. His former mistress, Thelma Furness, made a fatal tactical error. Preparing to travel to New York, she turned to her friend Wallace and said, I'm afraid the prince is going to be lonely. Wallace, will you look after him? It is one of history's great ironies. Wallace looked after him so well that by the time Thelma returned, she had been erased. Edward was now completely enthralled. He began to invite Wallace to Fort Belvedere every weekend, often with her husband Ernest in tow, a bizarre ménage à trois that polite society pretended not to notice. At the fort, Wallace took charge. She rearranged the furniture, fired the staff she didn't like, and dictated the guest list. She introduced American habits, triple-decker toasted sandwiches, highballs, and a casualness that horrified the old guard. The transformation in Edward was absolute. He became dog-like in his devotion. Observers at parties would watch in embarrassment as the Prince of Wales followed Wallace around the room with his eyes waiting for a signal. If she complained that her glass was empty, he would sprint to the bar to refill it. If she said she was cold, he would practically dismantle the room to find a shawl. He began to shower her with jewels, Cartier diamonds, emeralds, charms, spending a fortune to adorn his idol. But there was an edge of anxiety to his love. He was terrified of losing her. He wrote her letters that were almost hysterical in their neediness, using a private baby talk that is uncomfortable to read today. He called her Wallace and himself David, but also used code names and ciphers, creating a private universe of two. For Wallace, the situation was intoxicating but increasingly dangerous. She was gliding on the surface of a frozen lake that was beginning to crack. She enjoyed the glamour, the power, and the proximity to the throne. Who wouldn't? She was the queen of London society, the woman who had tamed the most eligible bachelor on earth. But did she love him? Many biographers suggest she was fond of him, perhaps even loved him in her way, but that she was also trapped. She was riding a tiger. To dismount was to lose everything. To hold on was to be carried toward a precipice. She assumed, like everyone else, that this was just a royal fling. Kings had mistresses. It was the way of the world. She would have her moment in the sun, and then, inevitably, he would marry a European princess, and she would retire to a comfortable life as a friend of the family. She never imagined, could not have imagined, that he would try to make the fantasy permanent. But Edward was not playing by the old rules. He was a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted, and he had decided that he could not exist without her. He was blurring the line between his public duty and his private obsession. He began to introduce her to his family, a breach of protocol that sent shockwaves through Buckingham Palace. He brought her to a party at the palace where she was presented to King George V and Queen Mary. The king was apoplectic. He later roared that he would not have that woman in his house again. He saw what his son couldn't, that Wallace was not just a girlfriend but a constitutional landmine. She was an American, a commoner, and, most unforgivably, divorced. In the 1930s, the Church of England, of which the king was the head, did not recognise divorce. For the heir to the throne to be involved with such a woman was a scandal waiting to break. As the winter of 1935 approached, the trap was set. The king was old and failing. The prince was lost in a blinding obsession. And Wallis Simpson, the woman from Baltimore, with the sharp tongue and the impeccable dress sense, was standing at the right hand of the throne, holding the heart of the empire in her manicured hands. The dinner party at Borough Court had ended, but the real feast, the consumption of a monarchy by a marriage, was just beginning. The music at the fort played on, louder and faster, drowning out the distant, ominous tolling of the bell. The year is 1936, and the winter has settled hard over the flat, marshy expanse of Norfolk. At Sandringham House, the private retreat of the royal family, the air is thick with the scent of pine, damp wool, and the unspoken certainty of the end. King George IV, the sailor king, who steered the monarchy through the wreckage of the First World War and the shifting tides of the 1920s, is dying. He is 70 years old, his lungs scarred by years of heavy smoking and the damp English climate, his body weary from a lifetime of rigid discipline. The house itself feels like a ship becalmed in ice. The corridors are hushed, the servants move like shadows, and the only sound is the relentless ticking of the clocks. It is here, in this red brick Victorian mansion, that the tragedy of the succession begins to take its final shape. George the Sauve is often remembered as a gruff Philistine stamp collector, a man who preferred his parrots and his shotgun to the complexities of the modern world. But as the light fades from his eyes, he possesses a terrifying clarity. He sees what no one else dares to whisper. He looks at his eldest son, David, now 41 years old, fidgeting with his tie, smelling of cigarette smoke and anxiety, and he sees a disaster waiting to happen. The King's assessment of the Prince of Wales is not just the grumbling of a disappointed father, it is a prophecy of chilling accuracy. In these final months, the King has confided in the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, with a heavy heart. "After I am dead," he says, his voice raspy with bronchitis, "the boy will ruin himself in 12 months. It is a sentence that hangs in the historical air like a verdict. But there is a second part to his prayer, one that reveals the depth of his foresight and his desperation. He looks past David, past the stuttering Duke of York, Bertie, to a little girl with golden curls playing in the nursery, his granddaughter Lilibet. "I pray to God that my eldest son will never marry and have children," he tells a courtier, "and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne." It is an extraordinary wish for a monarch to hope for the failure of his own direct line so that the crown might land safely on the head of a 10-year-old girl. Inside Sandringham, the atmosphere is suffocating. The tension between the dying father and the waiting son is palpable. David is restless, pacing the hallways, making calls to Wallace in London, his mind already halfway out the door. He commits a small but symbolic act of rebellion that shocks the household. For decades, the clocks at Sandringham have been kept half an hour fast, Sandringham time, to maximise the daylight for shooting. It is a quirk of the old king, a rule of the house. One of David's first acts, as he feels the power shifting toward him, is to order the clocks set back to the correct time. It seems trivial, a matter of minutes, but to the staff and the family, it is a violation. It is the new broom sweeping away the old habits before the body is even cold. It signals that the new reign will not respect the rhythm of the past. As January 20th dawns, the king drifts in and out of consciousness. The family gathers. Queen Mary, stoic and regal, sits by the bedside, her emotions hidden behind the wall of jyoti she built decades ago. David is there, oscillating between genuine grief and a panicked realization that his freedom is expiring. He is about to become the prisoner of the Constitution. He weeps, for he is an emotional man. But his tears are complex. Tears for his father, tears for himself, tears for the life he is losing. The end of George VI's life brings us to one of the most controversial and quietly horrifying moments in royal medical history, a secret that was kept for 50 years. As the evening of January 20th deepens, the king is clinging to life, his breathing ragged. His physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, is growing anxious. He is looking at his watch, not for medical reasons, but for deadline reasons. He knows that if the king dies too late in the night, the news will be carried in the working-class morning tabloids, or, horror of horrors, the evening journals. Lord Dawson believes that the death of a monarch belongs in the Times, the paper of record, delivered to the breakfast tables of the establishment. In a decision that historians still debate, was it mercy or manipulation, Dawson decides to intervene. He scribbles a note on a menu card, Give him 3 Secades 4 grain morphine shortly followed by 1 gram cocaine. It is a lethal cocktail designed to stop the heart gently but swiftly. The nurse, shocked, initially refuses, but Dawson, the figure of medical authority, insists. He then steps out to issue the famous bulletin, a masterpiece of euphemism that has entered the poetic lexicon of history. The king's life is moving peacefully towards its close. Back in the bedroom, the injection is administered. The king, unaware that his final exit is being timed for the printing press, slips away. At 11:55 p.m., just in time for the deadline of the Times, George V takes his last breath. The Victorian era, which had lingered on in his bearded, frock-coated presence, finally expires. The moment the king dies, the dynamic in the room shifts with the violence of a thunderclap. Queen Mary, the woman who has been the supreme matriarch, stands up. She walks over to her eldest son, takes his hand, and kisses it. Then she drops into a deep, reverence-filled curtsy. "God save the king," she whispers. It is a gesture of absolute submission to the office, if not the man. David looks down at his mother, the woman who has always been his superior, now bowing before him. He appears stricken, almost terrified. The weight of the crown, invisible but crushing, has landed on his shoulders. He is now King Edward VIII. He is the Emperor of India, the defender of the faith, the ruler of hundreds of millions of people. But in that room, smelling of death and winter, he looks less like a monarch and more like a lost child. He rushes to the telephone, not to call the Prime Minister, not to call the archbishops, but to call Wallace. He needs to hear her voice. He needs to tell her that the worst has happened. He is king. Outside, the snow begins to fall on the Norfolk fields, covering the tracks of the pheasants and the hares. The flag on the church tower is lowered to half-mast. The villagers whisper the news. But inside the warmth of the house, a different kind of cold is setting in. The prophecy of the old king hangs in the corners of the room like cobwebs. 12 months, he had said. The boy will ruin himself. The clock on the mantelpiece, now ticking the correct modern time, marks the first second of a reign that is doomed before it has even begun. The sunset of kings has ended, and the false dawn of Edward VIII has broken. It is a light that will dazzle, burn, and then, with shocking speed, go out. The reign of Edward VIII began not with a solemn procession, but with the roar of a propeller. On the morning of January 21st, 1936, just hours after his father's death, the new king did something that sent a tremor through the establishment before he had even signed a single document. He flew. Instead of taking the royal train from Sandringham to London, a slow, majestic, steam-shrouded journey befitting a grieving monarch, he drove to a nearby airfield and hopped into a small aircraft. To the modern ear, this sounds like a matter of efficiency. To the courtiers of 1936, it was a terrifying breach of protocol. Kings did not fly. The air was dangerous, unstable, and undignified. But Edward was the pilot of his own destiny now. As the plane lifted over the snowy fields of Norfolk, banking towards the capital, it was a clear signal. The Victorian pace was dead. The 20th century had finally arrived at Buckingham Palace, travelling at 100 miles per hour. When he landed in London, the energy of the new broom began to sweep through the dusty corridors of the monarchy with a frantic, almost violent intensity. Edward had long hated Buckingham Palace, calling it vast and musty and draughty. He viewed the royal household not as a sacred institution, but as a bloated corporation in desperate need of downsizing. Within weeks, he began to slash costs with the ruthlessness of a modern CEO. He walked through the palace, pointing out servants who were unnecessary, reducing wages, and cutting ancient perks. He even eliminated the staff's beer allowance, a petty economy that saved pennies, but cost him the loyalty of the very people who ran his bath and cooked his meals. There is a dark humour in the image of the King of England, the ruler of millions, arguing over the price of laundry and the number of footmen required to serve tea. He was a man obsessed with the small picture, while the big picture was catching fire. But the most visible symbol of this new reign and its reckless disregard for tradition occurred at St. James's Palace during the proclamation of his accession. By ancient custom, the new monarch is supposed to remain in seclusion while the heralds announce his title to the people. It is a moment of mystery where the king is spoken of but not seen. Edward, however, could not resist the urge to watch the show. He was photographed standing in a window of the palace, looking down at the heralds in their medieval tabards, and he was not alone. Standing beside him, clearly visible to the sharp-eyed and the telephoto lens, was Wallis Simpson. She was still a married woman, yet here she was, literally shadowing the king at the moment of his public birth. To the few in the know, the image was chilling. It looked, as one courtier whispered, like they were in a dugout together, surveying the battlefield of London, two against the world. Inside the palace, the daily business of kingship was grinding to a halt. The British monarchy runs on paper, endless streams of it, carried in leather-covered dispatch boxes. These red boxes contain cabinet minutes, foreign office telegrams, and documents requiring the royal assent. For George V, though, processing these boxes was a sacred duty, performed with the regularity of a metronome. For Edward VIII, they were a nuisance. He found the language dense and the topics boring. He began to leave the boxes unopened for days, piling up on his desk like unwashed dishes. Far more alarming to the government was the security risk. Historians have since confirmed what the Prime Minister feared at the time. The king was leaving state secrets lying around in the open at Fort Belvadier. Visiting guests, some of them with questionable political connections, would find top-secret telegrams about the rearmament of Germany scattered on side tables, sometimes stained with the rings of cocktail glasses. There was a genuine creeping panic in Whitehall that the king's casualness was leaking intelligence to foreign powers. It wasn't malice, necessarily, but a terrifying lack of seriousness. He treated the secrets of the empire like the gossip columns of a newspaper, interesting if scandalous, but ultimately disposable. The new broom also swept away the social rigidity of the court, replacing it with a brittle, Americanized glamour. The garden party list was scrutinized. The old duchesses, with their hearing trumpets and disapproving glares, were sidelined in favour of the fort set. Dinner at the palace became a different beast. Instead of 7 courses served in hushed silence, there were quick meals, loud jazz on the phonograph, and guests who smoked before the loyal toast, a breach of etiquette that made the old courtiers turn pale. Edward walked around in a lounge suit, often checking his watch, clearly bored by his own hospitality. He was trying to act the part of the people's king, a modern man who understood the common touch, but he was alienating the very machinery that sustained him. Yet, amidst this whirlwind of modernization, there was a deep underlying anxiety. Edward was frantic. He was trying to reshape the monarchy to fit Wallace, to create a throne wide enough for 2. He knew, with a gambler's instinct, that time was running out. He needed to secure her divorce, marry her, and have her crowned before the establishment could stop him. Every decision he made, from the guest list to the cost-cutting, was viewed through the lens of this singular obsession. He was clearing the decks not for efficiency, but for a wedding. The tension between the king and his staff became toxic. Alec Harding, the private secretary he had inherited from his father, was a man of the old school, stiff, correct, and deeply principled. He watched his master with growing horror. He saw the neglect of duty, the indiscretion, and the dangerous influence of Mrs. Simpson. The 2 men were like oil and water. Edward saw Hardinge as a spy for the establishment. Hardinge saw Edward as a derelict sentinel asleep at the post. Their interactions became curt and hostile. The king stopped consulting his advisers, preferring the counsel of Wallace, who, for all her wit, had zero understanding of the British Constitution. As the spring of 1936 turned into summer, the atmosphere in London grew heavy. The king was popular with the crowds. They loved his youth, his smile, his apparent modernity. They cheered him when he visited the Fleet or toured the slums. But those closest to the centre of power saw a man unraveling. He was drinking more heavily. His temper was short. He was suffering from what we might now recognise as a profound existential crisis, masking his panic with a flurry of activity. He was a man running a race against an invisible wall. There is a scholarly debate about whether Edward ever truly intended to be a constitutional monarch. Some argue he had the potential but was derailed by love. Others, looking at his behaviour in these first months, argue he was constitutionally incapable of the job from the start, that he was too narcissistic, too restless, too intellectually incurious to ever submit to the dull duty of the crown. The evidence of the red boxes suggests the latter. He wanted the adulation of the office without the administration. He wanted the uniform without the discipline. By July, the new broom had swept up a great deal of dust, but it had also choked the air. The king was exhausted. He felt the walls of the palace closing in. He needed an escape. He needed to be David again, not Edward VIII. He began to plan a holiday, not a sedate stay at Balmoral, but a sun-drenched, glamorous cruise in the Mediterranean. He chartered a yacht, the Nachlan. He invited his friends. And of course he invited Wallace. It was to be a summer of freedom, a last burst of golden light before the storm. He did not know it yet, but he was booking a ticket to his own downfall. The Nachlan would not just be a boat, it would be a floating stage, where the secret he had kept so carefully would finally be revealed to the world. The king was packing his bags, leaving the red boxes behind in the dark, and sailing toward the flashbulbs. The summer of 1936 burns hot and bright, a fever dream suspended between the grey duty of London and the coming darkness of war. In August, the king makes his escape. He charters the Nachlan, a luxury steam yacht as white and sleek as a gull's wing, and sets a course for the Dalmatian coast. This voyage is often remembered as a romantic idyll, a honeymoon in all but name. But to the historian's eye, it looks more like a frantic flight, a desperate run from the red boxes, the bishops, and the ticking clocks of the palace. Edward is not just going on holiday, he is trying to outrun his own shadow. The atmosphere on board is intoxicatingly informal. As the yacht cuts through the sapphire waters of the Adriatic, the stifling etiquette of the court is thrown overboard. The King of England, usually buttoned to the chin in uniforms or morning suits, is suddenly seen bare-chested wearing shorts, his skin turning a deep bronzed brown. He exercises on the deck, rowing a skiff with a manic energy, waving to the fishing boats that pass by. To the locals lining the rocky shores of Yugoslavia and Greece, he is a golden god, a figure of myth come to life. They do not see a constitutional monarch in crisis. They see a man in love. In the port of Dubrovnik, the crowds are so dense they threaten to push the police into the sea. They chant a phrase that surely never appeared in any royal briefing paper, Zivila Ljubav, long live love. The king, beaming, translates this for Wallace. Visibly delighted, it is the validation he craves. The people he believes are on his side. They understand the language of the heart, even if the Archbishop of Canterbury does not. Life on the Nachlan is a bubble of hedonism. The library on board is emptied of books to make room for cases of champagne and gin. The gramophone plays incessantly, jazz, foxtrots, the syncopated rhythms of America. Wallace is the undisputed queen of this floating court. She is always impeccable, her hair perfectly coiffed despite the sea breeze, her sharp wit keeping the guests entertained and on edge. She manages the king openly, correcting his manners, telling him when to stop drinking, or chiding him for his boyish exuberance. And the king, he loves it. He follows her like a puppy, his eyes constantly seeking hers. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, but emotionally true, that when she sends him to fetch something, he sprints. He is shedding the heavy armour of kingship and trying on the lighter, looser clothes of a husband. But while the sun shines on the Nahlin, the world around them is darkening. This is 1936. The Spanish Civil War has just erupted, a bloody prelude to the global slaughter to come. Mussolini is posturing in Italy. Hitler is rearming in Germany. The king's cruise takes him through waters that are becoming politically treacherous. Yet Edward seems oblivious to the geopolitical storm clouds. He is focused entirely on the woman beside him. There is a jarring disconnect between the frivolity of the yacht, the cocktails, the shopping trips in local bazaars, and the terrifying reality of Europe. It is a dance on the edge of a volcano, performed by people who refuse to look down. Crucially, this holiday shatters the last remnants of privacy. For months, the romance has been an open secret in London society, whispered about over teacups and martini glasses. But now it is public property, at least for the rest of the world. The American and European press are unleashed. Reporters hire planes to buzz the yacht. Photographers with long lenses stake out every harbour. They capture images that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. The King of England helping a woman into a boat, his hand lingering on her arm. The king drying her back with a towel, the king looking at her with naked adoration. These photos are splashed across the front pages of newspapers in New York, Paris, and Berlin. Time magazine runs features on the King and Mrs. Simpson. The world watches the soap opera with bated breath. Yet in Britain there is silence. A gentleman's agreement holds between the government and the press barons. Lord Beaverbrook and the other media moguls agree to suppress the story to protect the dignity of the monarchy. It is a conspiracy of silence that is almost impossible for us to comprehend in the age of the internet. The British public sees the king in the newsreels, smiling and tanned, but Wallace is edited out. They read bland reports of his educational tour of the Mediterranean. They have no idea that their sovereign is currently the lead actor in the world's most scandalous romance. This artificial silence creates a dangerous pressure cooker. The truth is swelling, pressing against the dam of censorship, and the longer it is held back, the more destructive the eventual flood will be. There is a scholarly note to be made here about the king's judgment. Did he know the foreign press was covering him? Of course. He bought the foreign papers when they docked. He saw the photos. He knew that the Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, were reading everything. He simply didn't care. Or perhaps more dangerously, he believed that his popularity was so immense that it would transcend the scandal. He was banking on the Prince Charming effect. He thought he could present the establishment with a fait accompli. I am the king, this is the woman I love, and the people are with me. It was a majestic miscalculation. He mistook the curiosity of the crowd for the consent of the Constitution. As September approaches, the Nahlin turns for home. The mood shifts. The golden light of the Adriatic fades into the grey mist of the North Sea. The return to reality is jarring. Edward travels to Balmoral, the royal stronghold in the Scottish Highlands. Balmoral is everything the Nahlin was not. Cold, formal, steeped in Victorian tradition, and ghost-ridden by the memory of his father. Edward hates it. He invites Wallace, of course, and her presence in the castle is a desecration to the old guard. She complains about the tartan carpets. She finds the draughty corridors miserable. The staff are horrified to see her acting as hostess, ordering dinner, and sleeping in rooms that belong to queens. The tension at Balmoral reaches a breaking point. One evening, the king, bored by the traditional Gillies ball and the endless bagpipes, orders the car to be brought around. He wants to drive to the train station to meet Wallace, who had briefly gone to London. He leaves his guests, the local dignitaries, and his duties behind. It is a snub that cuts deep. The locals, who have served the royal family for generations, are offended. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, who is visiting, watches this with a grim face. He sees a king who is not only distracted but derelict. Baldwin later famously remarks that he has never seen a man so spiritually lonely, but the most telling moment comes when the king is asked to open a new hospital in Aberdeen. It is a standard royal duty, the bread and butter of the job. Edward refuses. He claims he is still in mourning for his father. A palpable lie, given his summer of partying on the Narlin. The truth is, he wants to go to the station to pick up Wallace. The headline in the local paper the next day is savage in its restraint. King Edward in Aberdeen, surprised at his absence. It is the first crack in the dam. The press is beginning to turn. The summer is over. The tan will fade, but the photos will not. The Narlin has docked, but the voyage has taken the king far beyond the point of no return. He has shown the world his heart, and in doing so, he has exposed the monarchy to a vulnerability it cannot tolerate. He is back in the cage of Britain, but he is no longer the same animal. He is cornered, desperate, and deeply, dangerously in love. The silence of the British press is about to break, and the roar that follows will shake the throne to its very foundations. The stage is cleared. The supporting cast is watching, and the king is about to walk centre stage to deliver his ultimatum to an empire that has already decided his fate. Autumn in England is a season of beautiful decay, a time when the sky turns the colour of a bruised plum and the smell of wood smoke hangs low in the damp air. By October 1936, the leaves in the gardens of Fort Belvadier were turning a brittle gold, falling silently onto the manicured lawns. Inside the house, the mood mirrored the season. The frenetic energy of the summer had evaporated, replaced by a cold, tightening knot of dread. The garden party was over. The bill was coming due. The crisis, which had been a distant rumble of thunder, was now a storm breaking directly overhead. The catalyst was a legal proceeding in the quiet provincial town of Ipswich, a location chosen specifically for its obscurity. On October 27th, Wallis Simpson filed for divorce from her husband, Ernest. The hearing was a masterpiece of staged legal theatre. The police guarded the doors, keeping the press at bay. Mrs. Simpson, dressed in a sombre outfit chosen to convey respectability, gave evidence of her husband's adultery, a fabricated encounter in a hotel room, arranged solely to satisfy the rigid divorce laws of the time. It was a charade, a hollow ritual necessary to clear the path for a king, but while the court granted the decree nisi, the establishment was not fooled. They knew exactly what this piece of paper meant. It was not an ending, it was a beginning. It was the firing of a starting gun for a race the king was determined to run, and one the government was determined to stop. Enter Stanley Baldwin. The Prime Minister is a figure often caricatured as a sleepy country gentleman, a man who preferred his pigs and his pipe to the cut and thrust of high politics. He projected an image of reassuring dullness, the embodiment of his party's slogan, safety first. But beneath the tweed waistcoats and the heavy-lidded eyes lay a mind of sharp steel. Baldwin understood the British public better than Edward ever would. He knew that while they might cheer a handsome prince, they would not accept a twice-divorced queen who had 2 living ex-husbands. He sensed the moral temperature of the nation, the quiet conservatism of the suburbs and the shires, and he knew it was about to boil over. The confrontation begins, not with a shout, but with a request for an audience. Baldwin drives down to Fort Belvedere in his small, unassuming car, a stark contrast to the King's sleek American limousines. The meeting takes place in the drawing room, where the modern white walls seem to vibrate with tension. The 2 men are opposites in every way. Baldwin, the Victorian manufacturing heir, heavy, slow, and rooted in the earth. Edward, the nervous, fidgeting modernist, light, quick, and floating on air. Baldwin attempts to reason with the king. He speaks not of laws, but of feelings. He warns Edward that the respect for the monarchy is fragile, a crystal vase held in the hands of the people. "Sir," he rumbles, puffing on his pipe, until the room fills with the sweet, heavy scent of tobacco, "this marriage would not be approved by your people." He tries to explain that the king is not a private individual. He is the head of the Church of England, an institution that holds marriage to be indissoluble. To marry a divorcée would be to sever the head from the body. Edward listens, but he does not hear. He is trapped in the logic of romance. To him the issue is simple. He can do his job better if he is happy. "I am going to marry Mrs. Simpson," he tells Baldwin, his voice rising with a desperate conviction, "and I am prepared to go." This is the moment the ground shifts. Until now, abdication has been a theoretical ghost. Now, it has been spoken aloud. Baldwin is stunned. He had come to warn a king, not to dismantle a reign. Scholarly debate still circles this meeting like smoke. Did Baldwin secretly want Edward to go? Did he see the king's political naivety and his erratic behaviour as a danger to the state, and seize this opportunity to push him out? Some historians argue that Baldwin played a masterful game of chess, manoeuvring the king into a corner where abdication was the only exit. Others believe he genuinely tried to save the king from himself, only to find that the king did not want to be saved. The truth likely lies in the middle. Baldwin wanted a stable monarchy, and if Edward could not provide it, then Edward had to go. The pressure ratchets up. On November 13th, the king receives a letter that hits him like a physical blow. It is from his private secretary, Alec Hardinge, the man he has ignored and sidelined. Hardinge, risking his career, puts into writing what everyone is whispering. He warns the king that the silence of the press is about to break, and that if the government resigns in protest at the marriage, the king will be left powerless, facing a constitutional crisis that could destroy the throne. He urges the king to send Wallace abroad immediately. Edward is furious. He sees the letter not as a loyal warning, but as a betrayal, a conspiracy hatched by the grey men in the palace. He suspects, probably correctly, that Hardinge has been talking to Baldwin. The walls of the fort, once a sanctuary, now feel like the walls of a cell. The king calls Baldwin back to the palace. The mood is darker now. The time for polite metaphors is over. Edward throws his cards on the table. "I am prepared to go," he repeats, but this time he adds a terrifying ultimatum. "I will abdicate and marry her." He is challenging the government to call his bluff, hoping they will blink. He hopes they will say, "No, Your Majesty, you are too important. We will find a way." But the government does not blink. They know that a king who defies his ministers on a fundamental issue cannot remain king. In these desperate weeks, Edward grasps at a straw. He proposes a compromise, a morganatic marriage. This is an ancient Germanic concept where a royal marries a person of lower rank. She becomes his wife, but not queen, and their children do not inherit the throne. It seems like the perfect solution. He can have his cake and eat it too. He pushes this idea with the fervour of a drowning man. He imagines Wallace as the Duchess of Cornwall, a glamorous consort by his side, while he remains king. He asks Baldwin to consult the cabinet and the dominions. Baldwin agrees to ask, but his face is grim. He knows the answer before the question is even sent. The British Constitution has no provision for a half-queen. It is all or nothing. As the telegrams flash across the undersea cables to Ottawa, Canberra, Cape Town and Wellington, the king waits at the fort. He paces the terrace, kicking at the fallen leaves, watching the grey sky. He is alone. Wallace is in London, hounded by reporters, her nerves fraying. The silence of the telephone is deafening. The storm is no longer gathering. The first drops of rain are hitting the window pane. The gentleman's agreement with the press is crumbling. In America, the headlines are screaming. In Britain, the dam is leaking. A few provincial papers are printing cryptic editorials about a grave crisis. The Bishop of Bradford, in a seemingly innocent speech about the king's religious duties, drops a remark about the king needing more grace. It is the spark that lights the fuse. The press takes this as the signal to unleash the story. The presses in Fleet Street begin to roll, the ink wet and smelling of catastrophe. The headlines are being set in lead type. The King and Mrs. Simpson. Edward stands in the drawing room of the fort, a cocktail glass in his hand, the ice melting. He looks at the telephone, willing it to ring with good news. But deep down he knows. The deal is being written. The terms are being drawn up. He has gambled everything on the belief that his popularity is stronger than the institution. He is about to find out that the institution has been standing for 1,000 years, and it does not bend for one man, no matter how charming, no matter how loved. The storm has arrived, and there is no shelter left. The silence breaks not with the roar, but with the rustle of newsprint on a cold December morning. For months, the British public has been living in a carefully constructed fog, shielded by the deference of press barons who believed that some truths were too dangerous for the breakfast table. But on December 2nd, 1936, the fog lifts with shocking suddenness, revealing a landscape that is unrecognisable. The catalyst is the Bishop of Bradford, Dr. Blunt, a man whose name becomes a grim irony in the days that follow. In a diocesan address, he remarks that the king needs God's grace, lamenting that Edward has not shown enough awareness of his religious duties. It is a mild rebuke, intended for a local audience, but the press, starving for a hook, seizes it as the signal to drop the guillotine. The gentleman's agreement dissolves instantly. The editors in Fleet Street, who have been sitting on the story of the century, give the order, print it. The next morning the dam bursts. The headlines scream from every newsstand in London. The King and Mrs. Simpson, grave, constitutional crisis, marriage issues. To the average Briton, boarding the omnibus or buying a pint of milk, the news is a physical blow. They have known nothing of the Narlin, the duels, or the divorce hearing in Ipswich. They are suddenly told that their beloved bachelor king, the Prince of Sunshine, is not only in love, but intends to marry a twice-divorced American woman. The shock is visceral. People stand in clusters on street corners, reading papers over each other's shoulders, their breath steaming in the winter air. There is confusion, certainly, but also a strange protective anger. Who is this woman? Why has she stolen the king? And more dangerously, why were we not told? Inside the palace, the atmosphere shifts from anxiety to siege. The king is at Fort Belvadier, now truly a fortress against the world. The telephone lines are jammed. Cars are arriving and departing in a blur of gravel and headlights. But the king is not looking at the papers. He is looking at the government. He is waiting for the answer to his morganatic proposal, the compromise that would allow him to be king and Wallace to be his wife, but not queen. It is his last hope. the only bridge across the chasm. The answer arrives in the form of Stanley Baldwin walking slowly into the drawing room of the fort. He brings the verdict of the cabinet and, more importantly, the verdict of the Dominions. The telegrams have come back from Canada, Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand. The answer is a unanimous, thundering no. The Prime Minister speaks with a heaviness that fills the room. "Sir," he says, "the concept of a morganatic marriage is unknown to our law. Parliament would never pass it." He lays out the three choices that remain, stark and unforgiving as bone. 1. Give up Wallace. 2. Marry against the advice of ministers, causing the government to resign and triggering a constitutional crisis that would destroy the monarchy. 3. Abdicate. Edward listens, his face pale, his fingers toying with a cigarette. The bridge has collapsed. The compromise is dead. He looks at Baldwin and says, with a quiet finality that surprises even himself, "I cannot give her up." In that moment, the crown effectively falls from his head, though he will wear it for a few days longer. He has made the choice. He has chosen the woman over the institution, the personal over the political. But the drama is not just legal. It is deeply human, and it is about to turn violent. As the news breaks, the public mood toward Wallace turns ugly. She is no longer a glamorous curiosity. She is a villainess, a sorceress who has bewitched the king. Hate mail begins to pour into her London residence. Stones are thrown at her windows. Rumours fly that there are plots to throw acid in her face. Edward is terrified for her safety. He realises that as long as she is in England, she is a target, and her presence makes his decision impossible to execute calmly. He tells her she must go. She must flee the country. The night of December 3rd sees one of the most cinematic sequences of the crisis. The New Haven-Dieppe run, Wallace, accompanied by the King's Lord-in-Waiting, Peregrine Cust, climbs into a Buick and speeds out of Fort Belvadier under the cover of darkness. They are heading for the coast to catch the ferry to France. It is a terrifying drive. The press is in hot pursuit. Reporters are trailing them, their headlights cutting through the gloom, turning the journey into a high-speed chase. Wallace is huddled in the back, wrapped in furs, watching the English countryside blur past, a country she had hoped to rule. Now, a country she is fleeing like a criminal. She is frightened, exhausted, and confused. She leaves behind a king who is falling apart. Back in London, a last-ditch effort to save the king is mounting. Winston Churchill, the old warrior, romantic and impulsive, throws himself into the fray. He believes in the king. He believes in the power of the blood royal. He tries to form a king's party, a group of politicians who will stand by Edward and defy Baldwin. He strides into the House of Commons, ready to unleash his rhetorical thunder. He demands that no irrevocable step be taken, that the king be given time. But for once, Churchill misreads the room completely. The House is not in the mood for romance. It is in the mood for stability. They shout him down. "Sit down!" they roar. He is humiliated, flushed and angry, forced to retreat. The king's party evaporates before it is even born. The political class has closed ranks. They see Edward not as a martyr, but as a liability. At the fort, the king is alone. The woman he loves is in France, communicating only by crackling, insecure telephone lines. His brother Bertie, the shy, stuttering Duke of York, comes to visit. Bertie is terrified. He sees the abyss opening up before him. He knows that if David goes, he must step in. He pleads with his brother. They walk in the garden, kicking at the frozen leaves, two men trapped by an accident of birth. David is manic, talking quickly, justifying himself. Bertie is silent, crushed by the weight of a duty he never wanted. The press coverage intensifies. The tone shifts from shock to judgment. Editorials begin to question the king's character. They speak of duty, sacrifice, and service, words that Edward has used in speeches for 20 years, but now seem to have forgotten. The Times, the voice of the establishment, turns its heavy guns on him. The Church of England, led by the stern Archbishop Lang, remains icily disapproving. Edward realises he has lost the argument. He is not fighting for his throne anymore. He is fighting for his dignity and for the terms of his surrender. He begins to draft his abdication speech. He wants to explain himself. He wants to tell his people that he is not abandoning them out of cowardice, but out of a different kind of courage, the courage to be true to himself. But even his words are censored. The government demands to see the draft. They strike out passages that are too emotional, too defensive. They will not allow him to appeal to the people over the heads of the ministers. He is being silenced even as he speaks. The weather turns colder. A heavy fog descends on Windsor, wrapping the fort in a shroud of grey. The king sits in his study, the desk covered in papers he no longer bothers to read. He drinks brandy to steady his hands. He calls France every few hours, desperate for reassurance, but Wallace is distant, frightened, urging him not to do anything rash. But it is too late. The machinery of the state has engaged. The lawyers are drawing up the instrument of abdication. The glorious reign that began with a flight through the air is ending in a small room with a pen and a broken heart. The silence that broke on December 2nd has been replaced by a deafening roar of judgment, and soon it will settle into the permanent, echoing silence of exile. The king is dead. Long live the king. But first, the man must sign his name and walk out into the dark. The morning of December 10th, 1936, dawned grey and lifeless over the Surrey woods, the sky a flat sheet of slate, pressing down on the turrets of Fort Belvadier. Inside the house, the air was stale, with the smell of stale tobacco smoke and sleeplessness. The servants moved with the hushed, terrified efficiency of people preparing for a funeral, though the body in question was still walking, talking, and straightening his tie. In the octagonal drawing room, the very room where the king had once danced to jazz records and mixed cocktails for the fort set, a different kind of theatre was about to take place. A small table had been cleared. On it lay a single sheet of paper, crisp and white, bearing the title Instrument of Abdication. It was a document of terrifying simplicity, a few paragraphs of legal text that would dismantle a reign and redirect the river of British history. Shortly after 10:00 a.m., the witnesses arrived. They were not ministers or judges, but brothers. The three other royal dukes, Albert, Bertie, Henry, Harry, and George, walked into the room, their faces pale and drawn. The atmosphere was excruciating. These four men had been boys together, united by the strange, isolating trauma of their upbringing and the shared shadow of their father. Now, three of them were watching the eldest commit a kind of ritual suicide. Bertie, the Duke of York, looked physically ill. His hands shook, his eyes were red-rimmed. He was staring into the barrel of his own worst nightmare. The throne was coming for him, and he felt entirely unequipped to meet it. Edward, by contrast, seemed possessed by a strange, brittle calm. He was the only person in the room who wasn't crying or looking at the floor. He was manic, bustling about, treating the moment not as a tragedy, but as a piece of administrative business to be concluded so he could catch a train. At 10:30 a.m., Edward sat at the table. He took a fountain pen, and with a flourish that belied the gravity of the moment, he signed his name, Edward R.I., Rex Imperator. It was the last time he would ever use that signature. In the silence that followed, the scratching of the nib on the paper sounded like a scream. Then, one by one, his brothers signed as witnesses. When it was done, the king stood up. He was no longer the master of his fate, but he was free. The relief that flooded through him was palpable, a physical lightening of the burden that shocked those around him. He felt like a schoolboy released for the holidays. They felt like mourners at a graveside. But the theatre was not quite over. The act had to be proclaimed to the people. The following night, December 11th, the scene shifted to Windsor Castle. The sheer stone walls of the ancient fortress loomed in the darkness, a symbol of the permanence Edward was leaving behind. He was led to a small room in the Augusta Tower, where a microphone sat on a desk, a technological altar to the modern age. The Director General of the BBC, Sir John Reith, a man of stern Calvinist principles who deeply disapproved of the King's actions, was there to announce him. In a final, stinging humiliation, Reith did not introduce him as His Majesty the King. The abdication had technically taken effect earlier that day, when Parliament endorsed the instrument. Instead, Reith leaned into the microphone and spoke the words that confirmed Edward's fall. "This is Windsor Castle. His Royal Highness, Prince Edward." In millions of homes across Britain and the Empire, people huddled around their wireless sets. The streets were empty. The pubs were silent. The crackle of the radio was the only sound in the world. Then the familiar, clipped, slightly mournful voice began to speak. "At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own." The speech, drafted with the help of Winston Churchill, was a masterpiece of rhetorical emotion. It framed the abdication not as a dereliction of duty, but as a tragic necessity of love. "You must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." It was a line that would echo through the century, romantic to some, selfish to others. He spoke of his brother, Bertie, with a generosity that felt genuine. "He has one matchless blessing, enjoyed by so many of you and not bestowed on me, a happy home with his wife and children." It was a subtle acknowledgement of his own envy, a confession that the golden boy had been the poorest of them all. When he finished, he stood up, the script lying on the desk. He had said his goodbye. He had justified his existence. He walked out of the room and out of history's centre stage. There was a brief, awkward farewell with the family. The new king, George II, Bertie, was now the monarch. He bowed to his older brother, a gesture of instinct that he quickly corrected. But the confusion remained. What was Edward now? He was not a king, but he was not a commoner. In a moment of improvisational kindness that would later cause decades of legal headaches, the new king announced that he would create Edward the Duke of Windsor. It was a title invented on the spot to give the exile a handle, a scrap of dignity to wrap around his nakedness. Edward accepted it, unaware that this title would become the vessel for all his future bitterness. The final act of the night took place at Portsmouth Naval Base. A heavy mist had rolled in, obscuring the sea and the sky, as if the world were trying to erase the scene. Edward boarded the destroyer HMS Fury. He was leaving England, likely for a few months, he thought. He imagined he would return once the dust settled, to live as a country gentleman and an elder statesman. He did not know he was stepping into a wilderness that would last the rest of his life. As the ship slipped its moorings and drifted into the black Channel water, only a few figures stood on the dock to wave goodbye. The king over the water was gone. Back in London, the royal household let out a collective breath that was half sob, half sigh. The crisis was over. The threat was removed. But the wound was deep. The monarchy had been shaken to its foundations. The magic, the idea that kingship was a divine calling, a duty that could not be put down, had been shattered. Edward had proven that the crown was just a job, and one that could be quit if the terms weren't right. The next morning, the newspapers would print photos of the new king, George VI, looking anxious and frail, standing beside his strong Scottish wife, Queen Elizabeth. The caption would be, "The king is dead, long live the king." But in the nurseries and the drawing rooms, everyone knew the truth. The fairy tale was broken. The Prince Charming had not saved the kingdom, he had abandoned it. And as the Fury cut through the waves toward France, carrying the Duke of Windsor toward his reunion with Wallace, the deal began to harden. He had his freedom. Yes. But the price tag was hidden in the luggage, and it would be more expensive than he could ever have imagined. The destroyer, HMS Fury, did not carry the former king to the arms of his beloved, but to a winter of frozen solitude. For reasons of legal strategy, the lawyers had insisted on a cruel separation. Until Wallace's divorce became absolute in the spring, the couple had to remain apart to avoid any suggestion of collusion that might derail the legal process. So, while Wallace waited in the south of France, Edward was delivered to Austria, to a castle called Enzesfeld, owned by the banking dynasty of the Rothschilds. It was a golden cage set in a snow-covered landscape, luxurious, silent, and crushing in its isolation. For 5 endless months, the man who had been the centre of the world's attention sat by the telephone. He lived for the scratchy, long-distance calls to Tarn, his voice travelling over the wires to the woman who was now his entire reason for being. In between calls, he paced. He played the bagpipes until the sound echoed off the vaulted ceilings like a mournful ghost. He learned German. He went skiing, but the photographers were always there, hiding in the pine trees, their lenses trained on the fallen monarch, like hunters tracking a wounded stag. He looked older in these photos, thinner, his face etched with a new permanent anxiety. The boyish charm was curdling into something brittle. Back in London, the machinery of the deal was quietly grinding into gear. The new king, George VIII, was finding his footing, supported by a government and a family determined to excise the memory of Edward's disruption. The financial negotiations were bitter. Edward had claimed poverty, yet he had secretly taken a fortune with him from the royal estates at Balmoral and Sandringham, which he personally owned. He forced his brother to buy them back, a transaction that felt less like a transfer of heritage and more like a ransom payment. The relationship between the brothers, once tender, began to harden into a business arrangement mediated by lawyers and poisoned by money. But the cruelest cut was yet to come. It concerned the title. Edward assumed, with the arrogance of a man who had never been told no, that his wife would take his rank. He was a royal highness, therefore she would be a royal highness. It was the standard grammar of aristocracy. But the royal family, led by the steely Queen Elizabeth, the future Queen Mother, and Queen Mary, had drawn a line in the sand. They would not have that woman bowing and receiving curtsies as a member of the blood royal. Just days before the wedding, the blow landed. King George VI issued letters patent, a legal instrument of the sovereign, decreeing that while Edward would retain the title His Royal Highness, his wife and descendants would not. She would be the Duchess of Windsor, but never Her Royal Highness. It was a masterstroke of bureaucratic vengeance. It relegated Wallace to a permanent limbo, a duchess who was not quite royal, a wife who was legally inferior to her husband. To Edward, this was not just a snub, it was a mutilation of his honour. He viewed it as illegal, a petty act of spite that violated the laws of the peerage. Historians still argue the legality of this move. Many constitutional experts believe the king actually exceeded his authority. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict was final. Wallace was out. The reunion, when it finally came in May 1937, was set at the Château de Candé in the Loire Valley of France. It was a fairy tale castle, complete with turrets and a library of rare books, owned by a wealthy French-American industrialist. When Edward's train finally pulled into the station, he didn't wait for it to stop completely before jumping onto the platform. He rushed to Wallace, burying his face in her neck. The long winter was over, but the spring brought a chill of its own. As the wedding day approached, the guest list became a battlefield. Edward had fully expected his brothers, Bertie, Harry and George, to attend. He imagined them standing by his side as his supporters, the royal equivalent of best men. He believed that now the abdication was over. The family bond would reassert itself. He was devastatingly wrong. The order from Buckingham Palace was absolute. No member of the royal family was to attend. Furthermore, no British diplomat or government official was allowed to accept an invitation. The blackout was total. Edward spent his days on the telephone, begging his friends to come, only to hear the polite, embarrassed excuses of men who valued their social standing in London more than their friendship with an exiled duke. Lord Louis Mountbatten, his cousin, and once his closest confidant, declined. It was a rejection that Edward never forgave. The emptiness of the guest list was a physical manifestation of his new reality. He had traded a kingdom for a woman, and in doing so, he had become a social leper to the very class he had once led. On June 3rd, 1937, the ceremony took place. The date itself was a strange, subconscious choice. It was the birthday of his father, King George V. Whether this was an act of homage or a final, subconscious dig at the patriarch who had disapproved of him is a question for psychologists. The wedding was a small, sombre affair. The chateau was filled with flowers, peonies and lilies, but the air was heavy. There were no royal trumpets, no Archbishop of Canterbury. The Church of England had refused to sanction the marriage. At the last minute, a renegade clergyman from Darlington, the Reverend R. Anderson Jardine, volunteered to officiate, defying his bishop to give the couple a religious blessing. He was a small, brave figure in the vastness of the empty hall. Wallace wore a dress of Wallis blue, a colour created specifically to match her eyes, designed by Mainbocher. She looked elegant, severe, and terrified. Photos of the day show a couple who look less like triumphant lovers and more like survivors of a shipwreck clinging to a raft. Edward's face is a mask of strained joy. Wallace looks wary, her eyes scanning the horizon for the next threat. As they exchanged vows, the silence of the absent family screamed louder than any choir. There was no Duke of York, no Queen Mary, no glittering array of tiaras, just a handful of loyal staff, a few friends, and the press waiting outside the gates. When the ceremony was over, they sat down to a wedding breakfast of lobster, chicken in aspic, and strawberries. It was exquisite, perfect, and hollow. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor were now man and wife. The deed was done. But as they climbed into their limousine to drive away into the French countryside, the door to England slammed shut with a finality that vibrated through the chassis of the car. They were free, but they were adrift. They had each other, and they had their titles. One full, one half, but they had lost the context that gave their lives meaning. The deal was now fully operational. They would live in luxury, they would be photographed, they would be famous, but they would never, ever be allowed to matter again. The road ahead stretched out into a long, glamorous, empty tunnel, and the Duke, holding the hand of the woman, who was not a royal highness, began to realise that the hardest part of the abdication was not leaving the throne, but living with the silence that followed. The honeymoon period did not last long. It was quickly replaced by the terrifying silence of irrelevance. By the autumn of 1937, the Duke of Windsor was a man pacing the gilded cages of French hotels, desperate for a purpose. He had been the King Emperor, the most famous man on earth, and now he was merely a wealthy tourist with a golf handicap and a grievance. The silence from London was absolute. His brother, King George VI, was finding his rhythm. The government was ignoring him. The British press was burying him. Edward felt the sting of this erasure acutely. He needed to prove that he still mattered, that he was still a player on the world stage. It was this desperate hunger for validation, combined with a colossal political naivety, that led him into the darkest chapter of his life, a chapter that would stain his reputation forever. He decided to visit Germany. The invitation did not come through official diplomatic channels. The British Foreign Office was horrified by the idea, but through a shadowy intermediary named Charles Badeau, a French-American efficiency expert with business interests in the Third Reich. Badeau whispered into the Duke's ear exactly what he wanted to hear, that Germany revered him, that the German people missed him, and that the new regime in Berlin would treat him with the dignity he was being denied at home. Crucially, Badeau promised that the Germans would accord Wallace the full status of royalty. They would bow to her, they would call her Her Royal Highness. It was a trap baited with vanity, and Edward walked straight into it. In October 1937, the Windsors boarded a train for Berlin. As they crossed the border, the atmosphere shifted from the pastoral calm of France to the martial thrum of Nazi Germany. The station in Berlin was a sea of black uniforms and red flags. The platform was lined with SS guards, their jackboots shining under the harsh electric lights. But there were also crowds, thousands of ordinary Germans cheering, "Edward, Edward," with a fervour that rivalled his days as the Prince of Wales. To Edward, this was vindication. See? The people still loved him. He waved, his face lighting up with that old, dazzling smile, seemingly oblivious to the swastikas fluttering above his head. For the next 2 weeks, the Windsors were the stars of a grotesque propaganda show directed by Dr. Joseph Goebbels. The Nazis rolled out the red carpet in a way that Buckingham Palace never would. Wallace was curtsied to by high-ranking officials. She was addressed as Your Royal Highness at every turn. For the first time she was treated as a queen, and Edward beamed with pride. He did not see the manipulation. He saw only the respect he felt was his due. He was being love-bombed by a regime that saw him as a potent pawn to be used against the British government. The tour itself was a carefully curated illusion. The Duke was taken to see the miracles of the new Germany. He inspected factories where workers, terrified or hand-picked, smiled and sang. He visited the Strength Through Joy camps, marvelling at the clean dormitories and the healthy, athletic youth. He did not see the concentration camps that were already operating. He did not ask about the Jewish shops that had been smashed or the political dissidents who had vanished. He saw only order, efficiency, and a bulwark against communism. In a letter to his mother, Queen Mary, he wrote about how the German workers were happy and well cared for, a chilling testament to his blindness. But the centerpiece of the visit, the momentum that history holds its breath to watch, occurred high in the Bavarian Alps. The Windsors were driven up the winding mountain roads to the Berghof, Hitler's private retreat near Berchtesgaden. The air was crisp and cold, the scenery breathtakingly beautiful, a Wagnerian backdrop for a meeting of monsters and dupes. Hitler met them on the steps, dressed in his brown party uniform. The Führer was charming, deferential, playing the role of the humble host to the ancient blood of kings. He kissed Wallis's hand. He led them into the great room with its famous picture window, looking out over the mountains of Austria, the very mountains Edward had stared at during his lonely exile months before. What was said in that room remains a subject of intense historical speculation. No official transcript exists. We know they drank tea. We know they discussed the tragedy of war between their two Germanic peoples. Witnesses later claimed that Hitler told Edward it would have been a good thing for the world if you had remained king. It was the ultimate flattery, confirming Edward's own secret belief that he had been pushed out by warmongers and antiquated politicians. Edward, in turn, is said to have praised the achievements of the Reich, but it is the visual record that condemns him. Photographs from the tour show the Duke of Windsor inspecting SS honour guards, his face serious, his demeanour appreciative. And then there is the gesture. In several images, Edward is seen extending his arm. Defenders argue it was a wave. Critics and the Nazis themselves saw a Heil Hitler. The ambiguity is almost irrelevant. The optics were catastrophic. Here was the former King of England, the man who had worn the crown of the empire, standing on German soil and paying homage to the regime that was preparing to burn Europe to the ground. The reaction in Britain was one of nausea. The government was apoplectic. They saw the tour for what it was, a diplomatic disaster that gave legitimacy to a pariah state. The Labour Party, once sympathetic to Edward's Man of the People Act, turned on him. The press, no longer bound by the silence of the abdication, reported the tour with a mixture of confusion and disgust. The deal that the royal family had made to keep him in exile and strip him of influence suddenly looked not like cruelty, but like essential national security. Why did he do it? Historians still argue whether Edward was a true Nazi sympathiser or merely a useful idiot. There is evidence for both. He certainly shared some of the prejudices of his class and generation. He was anti-communist, and his remarks about Jews were often tinged with the casual anti-Semitism of the era. He also believed genuinely and naively that he could personally prevent a Second World War by building a bridge between Britain and Germany. He saw himself as a peacemaker, a lone voice of sanity in a world rushing toward madness, but his vanity blinded him. He could not see that to Hitler he was not a peacemaker. He was a potential puppet king, a card to be played if and when the Wehrmacht crossed the Channel. The tour ended, and the Windsors returned to Paris, glowing with the false warmth of their reception. They believed they had scored a triumph. They did not realise they had just nailed the door to England shut. Any lingering hope that Edward might one day return to live in his homeland to serve as a sort of queen mother figure for the nation was incinerated in the ovens of public opinion. He was now tainted. He was that man who shook hands with Hitler as 1938 and 1939 rolled on, and the tanks began to move into Austria and Czechoslovakia. The memory of the Duke's tea party at the Berghof transformed from a diplomatic gaffe into something darker, evidence of betrayal. The shadows were lengthening across Europe, and the Duke of Windsor, sitting in his Parisian mansion, was no longer just an embarrassment. To the men in Whitehall, reading the intelligence reports, he was beginning to look like a threat. The darkest tour was over, but the war was coming, and the question of whose side the former king was really on would become a matter of life and death. The war was over, but the peace brought no homecoming for the Duke of Windsor. In 1945, he and Wallace returned to France, not as returning heroes, but as drifting ghosts of a bygone era. The world had been remade by fire and steel. The British Empire was dismantling itself. The Labour government was building a welfare state, and the monarchy, under the steady hand of George VI, had reinvented itself as a symbol of shared sacrifice and duty. In this new, gritty, post-war reality, the Windsors were an embarrassment, anachronisms draped in jewels and smelling of pre-war cynicism. They settled into a life that can only be described as a golden vacuum. Their residence in the Bois de Boulogne in Paris was a masterpiece of interior decoration, a private palace filled with pug dogs, footmen in livery, and the clutter of royal memorabilia. It was a stage set for a play that had closed 10 years ago. Here, the Duke played the part of a king in exile. He insisted on full royal protocol. Guests were expected to bow and curtsy. The Duchess was addressed as Your Royal Highness by the staff and the sycophants who filled their dinner table. It was a fantasy world, hermetically sealed against the indifference of the outside world. Their existence became a perpetual motion machine of leisure. They followed the season with the migratory instincts of birds. Paris in the autumn and spring, the French Riviera or Biarritz in the summer, New York in the winter. They were fixtures of the café society, that glossy, superficial layer of high society that existed in the luxury hotels and ocean liners of the 1950s. They were photographed endlessly, at balls in Venice, at fashion shows in Paris, stepping off planes in Palm Beach. To the readers of glossy magazines, they were icons of style and romance. Wallace was always impeccable, her jewellery flashing, her clothes setting trends. Edward was the dapper, slightly sad-eyed gentleman in the background holding the pug. But beneath the surface of this glamorous drift lay a profound aimlessness. The Duke had no job, no official role, and no intellectual interests. He did not read books. He did not cultivate the arts. His days were consumed by trivialities. He would spend hours gardening, obsessing over the pruning of a single rosebush. He played golf with a grim determination. He needle-pointed cushions. He reorganized his wardrobe, fussing over the cut of a jacket or the knot of a tie. It was a life of aggressive idleness, a desperate attempt to fill the hours that stretched out before him like a desert. The deal with the royal family remained rigid. The Duke was still an outcast. He made occasional, brief trips to London, usually to see his tailor or his bankers, but he was never invited to Buckingham Palace. He would stay in a hotel or at the home of a friend, ignoring the great stone pile where his brother lived. The pain of this exclusion never healed. He wrote letters to the government, begging for a real job, perhaps an ambassadorship or a special envoy role. They were always politely declined. He was considered too controversial, too loose-lipped, too much of a liability. The relationship between Edward and Wallace, the romance of the century, began to show the strain of this claustrophobic existence. They were trapped together in their golden cage, bound by the enormity of the sacrifice he had made. Wallace in particular seemed to harden. She had never asked to be the queen of the world. She had wanted a comfortable life, and instead she had been handed the burden of a man who had given up an empire for her. She had to be worth it, every single day. She had to be perfect. The strain made her sharp, critical, and at times cruel. Witnesses at dinner parties would hear her snap at him, mocking his ideas or cutting him off mid-sentence. And Edward, he took it. He remained abjectly devoted, his eyes following her around the room, terrified of her displeasure. He was the architect of his own prison, and he loved the jailer. In 1952, the news came that King George VI had died. The stammering king, the reluctant brother who had carried the burden Edward dropped, had worn himself out. Edward travelled to London for the funeral alone. Wallace was not welcome. He walked in the procession, a small sorrowful figure behind the gun carriage. He met his niece, the new Queen Elizabeth II, a young woman of 25 who now wore the crown he had thrown away. The meeting was polite but cool. The new Elizabethan age was dawning, and Edward was a relic of the past. He returned to France immediately after the service, claiming he could not bear to be away from Wallace. In truth, there was nothing for him in England but ghosts. As the years rolled into the 1960s, the Windsors became caricatures of themselves. They were the royal guests at parties thrown by Texas oil tycoons and social climbers who wanted a touch of class. They were paid discreetly to attend events. The Duke wrote his memoirs, a king's story, a bestseller that earned him a fortune but further alienated his family by airing private grievances. He became a curiosity, a man who had once been a god and was now just a celebrity. Yet, in the quiet moments, the sadness was palpable. A journalist once asked him if he had any regrets. The Duke paused, his eyes clouding over, and said, "I've had a good life, but I have been a spectator." It was a devastating admission. He had been born to be the lead actor, and he had spent 40 years watching from the stalls. The wandering years were a long, slow fade out. The parties grew fewer, the friends died off, and the silence in the house in the Bois de Boulogne grew louder. The Duke was aging. The Peter Pan prince was becoming a frail old man, coughing in the damp Parisian winter, still waiting for the call from London that would never come. The deal held firm. He had his freedom, he had his wife, but he had lost his soul. The 1970s arrived, not with a roar, but with a slow suffocating quiet in the house in the Bois de Boulogne. The golden vacuum was losing its lustre. The Duke of Windsor was 77 years old, and the frantic energy that had defined his life, the nervous fidgeting, the constant travel, the obsession with fashion, was draining away, replaced by the stillness of old age. The body that had once been the most photographed in the world, the slender frame that had worn the uniforms of the Grenadier Guards and the breezy linens of the Riviera, was failing. Years of heavy smoking, the Virginia tobacco that had scented the rooms of Fort Belvadier and the cabins of the Narlin, had taken their toll. The diagnosis was throat cancer. The voice that had captivated an empire, the voice that had announced its own abdication over the wireless to millions, was being silenced by the very habit that had calmed its nerves. The house in Paris became a clinic of velvet and gold. Nurses moved silently across the thick carpets, their white uniforms stark against the French antiques. The pugs, sensing the shift in atmosphere, lay listlessly by the fireplace. Wallace, now largely bedridden herself with a litany of ailments and a hardening dementia that made her moods unpredictable, was no longer the sharp, commanding hostess of the 1930s. She was a frightened old woman watching her world shrink to the size of a sick room. The parties were over. The guests had gone home. The only visitor left was Death, and he was sitting in the corner, waiting. But before the end, there was to be one final, impossible scene in the royal drama. In May 1972, Queen Elizabeth II was scheduled to make a state visit to France. It was a diplomatic trip, a matter of treaties and trade, but the schedule included a private stop that carried more weight than any state banquet, a visit to her uncle. It was the first time the monarch would visit the home of the exile. It was a gesture of reconciliation, perhaps, or merely a final act of Christian charity toward a dying relative. Either way, it sent a tremor through the household. The preparations were frantic and heartbreaking. The Duke, ravaged by cobalt therapy and barely able to eat, was determined to receive his sovereign with the dignity of a prince. He insisted on getting out of bed. He insisted on being dressed. He wanted to stand. His doctors forbade it, warning that the exertion could kill him on the spot. A compromise was reached. He would receive the Queen in his sitting room, seated in his armchair, dressed in a blazer and tie, every inch the royal Duke, even as his body crumbled. Wallace, terrified and anxious, oversaw the cleaning of the house, as if scrubbing away 30 years of scandal. The medical equipment, the oxygen tanks, the drip stands, was hidden behind screens or shoved into closets. The stage had to be perfect. The illusion of the happy ending had to be maintained for the one last audience. On the afternoon of May 18th, the royal motorcade swept through the gates. The crunch of tyres on gravel was a sound the Duke had heard 1,000 times in his youth, usually signalling his own arrival. Now, it signalled the arrival of the niece, who wore his crown. Wallace met the Queen at the door. It was a moment of excruciating tension. The two women had never liked each other. The Queen Mother, Elizabeth's mother, had blamed Wallace entirely for the abdication and the premature death of King George VI. Yet, here on the steps of a Paris mansion, protocol held the line. Wallace, frail and nervous, sank into a deep, wobbling curtsy. The Queen, reserved but gracious, took her hand. It was a truce, signed in silence. The Queen was then led upstairs. She entered the Duke's sitting room alone. The door clicked shut, sealing the two of them in a capsule of history. What passed between them in those few minutes is mostly lost to the shadows, but the details that have emerged are poignant. The Duke was sitting in his chair, incredibly frail, his face a roadmap of pain. But as the Queen entered, he attempted to rise. It was an instinct of blood and breeding that bypassed his ruined muscles. He tried to bow. The Queen, horrified by his struggle, gently urged him to remain seated. She sat beside him. For 15 minutes, they spoke. They did not talk of the abdication, or the Nazis, or the bitterness of the deal. They talked of small things, the weather, the pugs, the garden. He asked about her children. He called her Lilibet, the childhood nickname that only the family used, a word that bridged the decades and stripped away the titles. In that room, he was not the Duke of Windsor, and she was not the Queen. They were simply an uncle and a niece, survivors of a family storm that had changed the world. Witnesses say that the Duke was lucid, his mind sharp, even as his voice rasped and failed. He was desperate to show her that he was at peace, that he had been happy. He wanted her blessing, or perhaps just her witness. The Queen, for her part, was visibly moved. She saw before her the man who had been the golden figure of her childhood. The Uncle David, who used to play games with her, now reduced to a skeleton in a blazer. The tragedy of his life, the waste, the exile, the loneliness, was laid bare in the clinical light of the afternoon. When the time came to leave, the Queen rose. The Duke, gathering the last reserves of his strength, insisted on standing again. He managed it, swaying slightly, holding on to the arm of his chair. He bowed his head. It was his final act of submission to the crown he had once worn. It was an acknowledgement that she was the monarch and he was the subject. The hierarchy had been restored. The Queen left the room with tears in her eyes. As she walked down the grand staircase, the house felt heavier, as if the spirit that had been holding it together had finally let go. Outside, the cameras clicked, capturing the Queen's departure. She looked solemn. Wallace stood at the door, waving, a tiny, fragile figure in a smart dress, watching the link to England drive away. The visit was over. The reconciliation was technically complete, but it was a reconciliation of the dying, not the living. There was no offer to return to England, no restoration of titles, no invitation to Windsor for the summer. The deal remained. The Queen had come to say goodbye, not to say welcome home. Inside the house, the Duke collapsed. The effort had drained him completely. The nurses rushed back in. The oxygen tanks were wheeled out from their hiding places. The velvet curtains were drawn against the spring sunlight. He would never leave his room again. The visit had been his final performance, the last scene in the long, strange play of his life. He had looked the crown in the face one last time, and he had not looked away. In the quiet days that followed, the Duke drifted in and out of consciousness. He spoke of his mother, Queen Mary. He spoke of the fort. He murmured names from the past, ghosts who were gathering around the bed. Wallace sat by his side, holding his hand, her own mind fragmenting under the stress. They were two castaways on an island of their own making, the waters rising around them. The anger, the ambition, the desperate need for validation, all of it was fading into the white noise of the pain medication. 10 days after the Queen's visit, on the evening of May 28th, 1972, the Duke of Windsor died. He was 77. The heart that had ruled his head, the heart that had chosen love over duty, finally stopped beating. The news flashed around the world. In London, the flags were lowered. The BBC interrupted its programming, but there was no outpouring of national grief, no weeping in the streets, as there had been for his father or his brother. There was only a quiet, respectful pause, a sense of a book finally being closed. The king over the water was gone. The problem was solved. But even in death, the deal had one last clause to enforce. The body had to go back. The Duke had requested to be buried at Frogmore, in the grounds of Windsor Castle, alongside his family. He wanted to rest in the soil of England, under the trees he had played Nissa in as a boy. The Queen granted this final wish. The RAF plane was dispatched to Paris to collect the coffin. The prodigal son was coming home, not to reign, but to rot. And Wallace, the woman for whom he had given it all, would have to travel with him, to face the country that had rejected her alone. The long sleep was beginning, but the final act of the tragedy had one last ritual to perform. The return of the king was a silent affair, stripped of the pageantry that had marked his life. On May 31st, 1972, a Royal Air Force VC-10 touched down at RAF Benson in Oxfordshire, carrying a cargo that the British establishment had dreaded for 35 years. The body of Edward VIII. He had left as a scandal. He returned as a problem to be buried. The coffin, draped not in the royal standard that flies over palaces, but in his own personal standard as the Duke of Windsor, was lowered onto English soil. There were no cheering crowds, no bands playing God Save the King. There was only the sound of the wind on the tarmac and the clipped commands of the bearer party from the Grenadier Guards, the regiment he had been so desperate to join as a boy in the Great War. Wallace, fragile and confused, descended the steps of the plane alone. She was entering the lion's den, the country that had rejected her without her protector. Her face, veiled in the heavy black crepe, was a mask of terror and grief. She was 85 years old, her mind fraying at the edges, and she was about to endure the most excruciating weekend of her life. The body was taken to St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle to lie in state. For 3 days, the public was allowed to file past. The reaction surprised the government, which had expected indifference. Instead, nearly 60,000 people queued for hours, the line snaking down the hill into the town. They were mostly older people, men in trilby hats and women in sensible coats, the generation that remembered the Prince of Sunshine. They did not come to mourn the bitter exile of the Bois de Boulogne. They came to say goodbye to the golden youth of the 1920s, the memory of their own lost optimism. Inside the chapel, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of lilies and candle wax. The coffin stood on a catafalque in the nave, bathed in the coloured light streaming through the stained glass. To the side, watching from the shadows of the royal apartments, was Wallace. She was staying at Buckingham Palace, a guest of the Queen, finally sleeping under the roof she had once hoped to rule. But it was a hollow victory. She was heavily sedated, her mind drifting between the present and the past. At night, she was heard wandering the corridors, calling out for David, asking why he hadn't come to bed. The palace staff, who had been trained to despise her, found themselves pitying the confused tiny woman lost in the cavernous rooms. The funeral took place on June 5th. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic choreography, designed to honour the rank without celebrating the reign. The service was private, stripped of the state pomp that accompanies the death of a sovereign. Inside the choir of St. George's Chapel, the royal family gathered. The Queen Mother, and the young Prince Charles stood in their stalls, surrounded by the banners of the Knights of the Garter. The tension was palpable. The Queen Mother, the Iron Matriarch, who blamed Edward for forcing her shy husband onto the throne, stood just a few feet from Wallace. They did not speak. Wallace sat next to the Queen, a placement that was technically correct, but emotionally jarring. She looked incredibly small, a shrunken figure in a coat by Givenchy, her eyes fixed on the coffin. Occasionally, she would reach out a gloved hand as if to touch it, a gesture of raw, unscripted pain that pierced the stiff upper lip of the congregation. The service itself contained a moment of supreme irony. The Garter King of Arms, wearing his medieval tabard, stepped forward to proclaim the styles and titles of the deceased. For the first time since the abdication, the forbidden words rang out in the sacred space. Sometime our most high, most mighty, and most excellent monarch, Edward VIII. It was an acknowledgement of historical fact, a brief restoration of the truth before the earth covered it up. The king was allowed into the room for 10 seconds, and then he was gone again, replaced by the Duke of Windsor. After the service, the procession moved to Frogmore, the private royal burial ground in the home park of Windsor. It is a quiet, secluded place, shaded by great plane trees and cedars, far from the public gaze. This was the final clause of the deal. Edward was not to be buried in the royal vault alongside the kings and queens of history. He was to be buried in the ground slightly to the side near the mausoleum of Queen Victoria. It was a location that signified connection, but also distance. As the coffin was lowered into the grave, the Queen sprinkled earth upon it from a silver bowl. The cycle was complete. The boy born at White Lodge, who had travelled the world, shaken the hands of millions, and courted the destruction of his own house, was back in the damp green embrace of England. Wallace stood by the open grave, swaying slightly, supported by Lord Mountbatten, the man who had refused to come to her wedding. She whispered a final goodbye, her lips moving in a conversation no one else could hear. Then she turned and walked away, back to the car, back to the plane, back to Paris. The story should end there, but the deal had a cruel postscript. Wallace lived for another 14 years. She returned to the house in the Bois de Boulogne, which became a mausoleum of silence. Her health collapsed completely. She lost the power of speech, then the power of movement. She spent more than a decade lying in her bed, surrounded by the Duke's things, kept alive by nurses and tubes. She became a prisoner of her own longevity. The world forgot her. The royal family paid for her care, a final, quiet transaction to keep the scandal contained. But they did not visit. She was the ghost in the machine, the last loose end of the abdication crisis, slowly fading away in a darkened room in France. When she finally died in 1986, she was returned to Windsor to be buried next to Edward. The deal allowed them to be together in death, sharing a single simple gravestone of Portland stone. It reads simply, Edward VIII, 1894-1972, and Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, 1896-1986. Even on the stone, she is denied the Her Royal Highness. The compromise was etched in granite, lasting literally forever. So, what remains of the man who gave up the world for love? Edward VIII is often romanticised as a martyr to the heart, or demonised as a Nazi sympathiser. The truth, as always, is messier. He was a man of immense charm and immense selfishness, a modern celebrity trapped in a medieval institution. He broke the monarchy to save himself, but in doing so, he unintentionally saved the monarchy. By leaving, he made way for the steady, dutiful George VI and the long, stable reign of Elizabeth II. He was the fever that broke, allowing the patient to recover. His legacy is not in the laws he passed or the wars he won, but in the lesson he taught, that the crown is a burden that demands total surrender. He tried to negotiate with destiny, and he lost. The deal they never forgave was not just the abdication. It was the revelation that a king is just a man, and a very fallible one at that. Now the leaves are falling on the grave at Frogmore. The noise of the 20th century has faded. The jazz records, the flashbulbs, the screaming crowds, the air raid sirens, they are all gone. There is only the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant hum of a plane carrying someone else somewhere else. The Duke and the Duchess are finally alone, truly alone, with no one to judge them, no one to snub them, and no one to tell them what they can or cannot be. The golden cage is open. The birds have flown, and in the silence of the garden, under the heavy English earth, the deal is finally, truly settled. The camera pulls back, rising slowly from the simple gravestone at Frogmore, up through the canopy of the ancient cedar trees. We drift higher, over the grey stone towers of Windsor Castle, over the winding ribbon of the River Thames, and up into the velvet expanse of the night sky. The history we have walked through, the gaslight of the Victorian nursery, the mud of Flanders, the jazz of the 20s, the heartbreak of the abdication begins to blur, becoming just another layer in the deep sediment of time. It is all over now. The arguments are finished, the letters are filed away. The pain has been smoothed out by the gentle erosion of the years. There is nothing left for you to carry. You can let the weight of the crown, the worry of the deal, and the noise of the world simply drop from your shoulders. It belongs to the past, and the past is a quiet country where everyone is sleeping. You are safe here, in the present, in the warmth of your own space. The darkness is not empty. It is a soft blanket wrapped around you to keep the world at bay. Let your breathing slow down, matching the rhythm of the wind outside, in and out, deep and slow. The story is done, the book is closed, the night is yours. Sweet dreams.